Welcome to Canadian Justice. I'm Christine Van Gyn, and today we're looking into the debate over paid surrogacy in Canada. Surrogacy is when a woman carries a baby for another family, a baby that was conceived through assisted reproduction. Now, the reasons for needing a surrogate are plentiful, but it's often a choice made by families who are faced with infertility or by same-sex couples. Now, while Canadian law allows surrogacy agreements, it's a criminal offense to pay a surrogate mother for her services. Canada only allows altruistic surrogacy, which means surrogate mothers can only be compensated for their surrogacy-related expenses. Paid surrogacy is permitted in other countries, though, including the United States. There have been attempts to change this law in recent years. For example, in 2019, Liberal MP Anthony Housefather introduced Private Members Bill 404, which would have decriminalized surrogacy, as well as permitted payment for sperm and egg donations. However, the bill never progressed. Today, we're going to be looking into the debate over paid surrogacy. Should the law change to allow families to pay the women who help them have children? Or is this a form of unconscionable baby buying? We're going to be looking into this debate and joined by Karen Busby, professor at Robson Hall Law School in Manitoba, Peter Jaworski, ethics professor at Georgetown University, and Andre Schutten, director of law and policy at the Association for Reformed Political Action. Thank you all so much for joining me today. Now, Professor Busby, I'd like to start with you. You've argued in favor of surrogacy in Canada, in favor of paid surrogacy. Do you have any concerns or response to the claim that this is a form of baby buying?
Yeah, I think the short answer is that, many people are involved in surrogacy, from the counselors who do initial screening to the fertility doctors to the lawyers. And it just seems to me unfair that the person who does the most of the work and has the greatest time and inconvenience is not paid for what she's doing. So it's a simple fact that women should be paid for the work that they're doing, and this should be no exception to that.
So, Mr. Schutten, your organization has raised concerns about surrogacy generally, both paid and altruistic. Can you explain why your organization is opposed to surrogacy when the reality is it's one of few options available for some families who want to have children?
Surrogacy, by its design, inflicts a primal wound right at the beginning of a child's life, as soon as they exit the womb of their surrogate mother. And that's something that we shouldn't abide in Canadian law. I think that there's certain things that money can buy and that money cannot buy, children being one of them. And there's certain things that money cannot rent, wombs being one of them. So because of the primal wound that's inflicted by surrogacy, I think that puts it out of bounds for paid compensation.
Now, I have a question for Peter about that. Professor Jaworski, do you think that there are things that money can't buy, and is this one of them?
So I definitely think that there are things that money shouldn't buy. Those are the same things that we shouldn't be allowed to exchange for free or otherwise. I definitely do not think that this is a case. I mean, I'm actually not clear on what it means to say that a child is subject to a primal wound by not being birthed by their, genetically related mother or by the use of a surrogate. I did want to make one point. In this debate, a lot of people discuss the issue as though the people who are paid to be surrogates are exploited. And I wanted to address that. I wanted to say that no, it isn't. And if you look at studies in the United States, the overwhelming majority of the women that participate are middle class, they are married, right? They report themselves that they do not feel as though they are exploited, and they are college educated. I would expect a Canadian commercial surrogacy. I would expect the companies in Canada to behave very much like they do in the United States. And so I just don't see a case for either exploitation. And I don't understand what an argument about the primal wound would amount to. And I want to echo Professor Busby's point about the inherent unfairness of paying everyone surrounding surrogacy, and also just regular birth too, right? Except for the commercial surrogate. That seems to me unfair, which is why I also support legalizing commercial surrogacy in Canada.
Thank you all so much. We're going to jump back into this conversation when we come back from these commercial messages. Welcome back to Canadian Justice. I'm Christine Van Gyn, and we're talking about the debate over paid surrogacy in Canada. Now, Professor Busby, I want to follow up with you on something that Mr. Schouten had said about harm caused by surrogacy, paid or unpaid. Is there any evidence that paid or unpaid surrogacy causes harm to either the children or the families involved in surrogacy?
As Professor Jaworski has said, there have been a number of studies on the experiences of women who've acted as surrogate mothers. And all of these studies consistently say that women who are surrogates enjoy doing what they're doing and they want to do it. They almost always have had their own children. They love being a mother. They enjoy being pregnant, and they want someone else to have the same experience as they've had. So I started doing this work because I thought that surrogacy was exploitative to women, and I thought that that's what the social science evidence would show us, is that it's exploitative to women, and including something like a primal wound, if you want to describe it that way. But the social science evidence just doesn't support that. It just doesn't support it. In a number of different studies done in a number of different ways in a number of different places, the outcome is the same, that women enjoy doing this and they think they're making a really important contribution in doing this.
So, Mr. Schouten, I want to follow up with you on some of the exploitation arguments that that Professor Busby and Jaworski have raised here. You know, if surrogacy is a form of exploitation in your mind, and we criminalize it in Canada, doesn't that just mean that people seeking surrogates will leave Canada and go to another country where there are arguably even fewer protections for women acting as surrogates?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I understand the rationale behind an argument like that, but imagine you applied the same argument to things like child sex exploitation, for example. I mean, it's well known that there are certain countries in the world that will tolerate that type of thing, and yet we will not tolerate it here because of the harm to children, whether that's here domestically or internationally. And so that's why I believe that the law should not only make it illegal to pay for surrogacy here, but also should be making it illegal to pay for surrogacy overseas as well. And when I'm talking about the primal wound, the intentional infliction of primal wound, I'm not talking about the surrogate mother. I'm talking about the child. That child, for 9.5 months, has built a bond with only one other human being in the world, and that is the surrogate mother. It's that mother's heartbeat that is soothed it at night. It's that mother's smell that it remembers when it's born. It's that mother's voice that gives it comfort. And the only person it knows is that mother. And at birth, instead of that child being held by that mother, we intentionally rip the child away from that mother and give them to two total strangers. That's the primal wound I'm talking about.
I mean, I don't know that I agree with the comparison to exploiting, like, child sexual exploitation. I mean, these are families who are looking to add love to another child and want to love a child and bring it into their family. Professor Jaworski, do you have a response to any of that?
Yeah, I mean, the argument that's been raised about the primal wound would imply that we should make adoption illegal as well.
No.
It inflicts the same primal wound. Here is the mother whose heart was felt by the baby, and now the mother is giving birth to the child, but then she gives it up for adoption. If the primal wound argument is a really strong argument against commercial surrogacy, then it is simultaneously a really strong argument against allowing adoptions in Canada as well. Okay, so I'm curious to hear why not.
Well, because there's three key differences between adoption and surrogacy. With adoption, we're seeking to mend a family wound. The adoption is a necessity born out of brokenness outside of the child's will and outside of the adoptive parent's will. The parents in the adoption situation, I'm speaking as an adoptive parent, the parents are stepping into that arrangement to fix or try to mend something that's broken. With surrogacy, it's an intentional breaking of that bond. It's designed that way. So we're designing the infliction of the wound into the surrogacy arrangement. And furthermore, like again, this should be true of all public policy. We have to always start with what's in the best interest of the child. Who's the client in adoption? It's the child. Who's the client in surrogacy? It's adults, and producing a product for an adult that wants it. And then finally, the difference between adoption and surrogacy, that with adoption, it's about adoptive parents sacrificing and supporting the child who has gone through trauma. But in surrogacy, it's the child who's supporting the adult's desires and wants. And the surrogate parents, they're the ones who are actually responsible for the trauma that the child has suffered at the moment of their birth.
All right, this is a fascinating debate, and we're going to get back into it after these commercial messages. Welcome back to Canadian Justice. I'm Christine Van Gyn, and we're talking about the debate over paid surrogacy. Now, Professor Dworsky, I have a question for you about paid surrogacy specifically. Right now in Canada, only altruistic surrogacy is permitted. You can only compensate a surrogate mother for surrogacy-related expenses like prenatal vitamins or maternity clothing. If we allowed commercial surrogacy, wouldn't that drive up the price of surrogacy, which is unavailable for a lot of families, and mean that it's a service that would only be available to the wealthy?
So the answer to that question is it depends, but I think the answer is no. If we allowed commercial surrogacy in Canada, I would expect it to be somewhat cheaper than for Canadians to travel to California in order to hire someone to be a surrogate, or to use the workaround where you go to the US, you get paid in the US, and then you have to travel back and forth in order for it to be legal. This making commercial surrogacy wouldn't make altruistic surrogacy illegal. So people who cannot afford commercial surrogacy can still try to find a loved one, like a sister, for example, who might be willing to carry a baby to term. So in every respect, it looks like it would make it slightly cheaper and so more accessible, and it wouldn't remove the option of altruistic surrogacy either.
Interesting. Okay, so Professor Busby, you've raised a concern that you have about families that come from outside of Canada to find a surrogate in Canada, because our country is somewhat a surrogacy destination. But this means that non-Canadians would be benefiting from Canada's taxpayer-funded healthcare system without having contributed to it. What's your view on this issue?
Well, first of all, I'll start by saying that Canada has become an international surrogacy destination. This was not intended. It's a complete surprise, but there's a number of factors that come together to create this synergy. So that's kind of a surprise. And one of the factors, of course, is that all of the prenatal and delivery expenses of the surrogate mother are covered under Canada's healthcare plan. And the any postnatal care of the child is also covered by Canada's healthcare plan. And as well, surrogate mothers are entitled for employment insurance benefits. So there's significant financial benefits to having a Canadian surrogate.
So it's actually cheaper to do it here for families looking.
Oh, way cheaper, because you don't. The medical costs are all covered, and there's compensation for maternity leave for the surrogate mother. Now, should non-Canadians be able to benefit in this way? It seems to me there's something kind of wrong with Canada paying for all of these expenses, but I'm not sure how we would get around that problem.
Interesting. Peter, did you want to address that? Yeah, sure.
Yeah, because we do have a Canadian too, right? The baby, as Andre suggested, I mean, the baby is Canadian. Any baby born in Canada is a Canadian baby, and the expenses that the woman incurs in the process of childbirth, that benefits the baby, right? I mean, there are American companies that hire Canadians to chop down trees in British Columbia or elsewhere, and they benefit in a way. If their employee is injured, then the employee who is a Canadian gets to use Canada's healthcare system. This is no different.
Okay, Mr. Schutten, I want to turn to you. Your organization has focused a lot on situations where surrogacy has gone wrong. But there's a good deal of research that shows that surrogacy works for many people, and the disputes are actually quite infrequent. So is it worth denying families access to surrogacy in order to prevent unlikely scenarios of things going wrong? And can't some of these disputes be headed off in advance by well-drafted surrogacy agreements?
So again, I mean, fundamentally, I think there's a problem that we can't get around, and that's what surrogacy does to the preborn child and that child once they're born and enter into the world. But I think that the problems are so severe, and that there are alternatives available that would address the same concern, particularly adoption of a child in need of stable homes. That with those two policy options available to us, I think that there's no need to open the door to commercial surrogacy. Again, I'm speaking as an adoptive father as well. The Children's Aid Societies across this country have a bit of a crisis on their hands with the amount of children that are in foster care right now looking for stable homes. I know of all kinds of couples that have made use of that means to bless a child, to be a stable source of support for a child in those kinds of circumstances. That should be the way our public policy is encouraging people to go.
So your solution for families who can't have children would be adoption rather than surrogacy?
Yeah, that's right. Well, I mean, and that's one option. There's other options about pursuing natural means, but assuming that
Okay.
has been explored.
Andre, we just have to go to commercial break, but
Okay.
This is a great conversation. We'll get back into it right after this. Welcome back to Canadian Justice. Let's jump back into it with our conversation about paid surrogacy. Professor Busby, there are some countries in the world that outright prohibit surrogacy, either paid or unpaid. Could you tell me what the experience for families is like in those countries?
In fact, most countries in the world prohibit either commercial or altruistic surrogacy. Only 6 or 7 permit it. A very small number permit it. When some countries in the global south, notably India and Thailand, opened their borders to international surrogacy, researchers quickly established that surrogates were abused in a number of ways. So, for example, they were denied decisional autonomy during pregnancy. They were essentially put in a home and locked up for their pregnancy. They weren't provided with postnatal health care, and they were only paid if a healthy baby was born. And in the end, fairly quickly, within 2 or 3 years of opening international surrogacy up, these countries closed their border to international surrogacy because women were being exploited really terribly in those countries.
And so, Mr. Jaworski, I know that you've had a lot to say about the exploitation argument. What types of limits do you think there should be on surrogacy in order to address the situations Professor Busby has raised just now?
I mean, I think there should be standard limits on the kinds of contracts that people can sign in general. So you have to be old enough, you have to be sufficiently knowledgeable. And in a way, I mean, the way that surrogacy operates in the United States, they go through a long process that also tries to ensure that the potential surrogate is also doing it for certain kinds of reasons. So they exclude, as a matter of course, people who are financially desperate. Right. So the tendency is, as I've said, to take only women who are married, middle class, and college educated. Right. So I think in terms of limits, I would expect the Canadian commercial surrogacy companies to operate just like the American ones. In fact, I would expect some American companies to expand into Canada, in which case the limits that should be placed on this would just come as a matter of, I don't know, this is the way that they run their business. So that's what I would expect in Canada.
Mr. Schutten, currently babies that are born to commercial surrogates outside of Canada, for 2 Canadian families seeking babies, they will still be granted Canadian citizenship, even though that surrogacy arrangement would be criminal if it took place in Canada. So what's your view on that?
Well, yeah, that's a difficult situation, and I'll be completely honest. I haven't quite wrestled through it to really know firmly which side we should land on that question. I mean, I don't want to have a public policy that basically ends up endorsing the decision to begin with, and yet at the same time, the child should not be the one, bearing the brunt of the cost or paying the penalty for the mistakes or the illegal action of the parents. So I am a little stuck on that one, I'll be honest.
Professor Busby, I want to close with you. Where do you see the law going on this in the future in Canada? Do you think bills like 404, which I talked about at the beginning, do you think they have a chance?
Yeah, I think the demand for surrogacy is going to continue to rise. There's a high demand now and it's not being met. But before we decriminalize commercial surrogacy, I think we need to have very strong professional guidelines in place and legislation that regulates surrogacy in order to protect surrogate mothers. So I'll just give one example. There needs to be a clear guideline that there should only be a single embryo transfer because it's really dangerous to have multiple transfers. And surrogates have to be treated as the patient.
That's a wonderful advice. And I want to thank you all three for your contribution to this conversation today. We've heard today about the debate about paid surrogacy and whether families looking to bring a new life into this world should be allowed to pay the women who help make that possible. We've also heard about the ethical and legal concerns about paying for surrogacy, about exploitation and commodification. Babies are wonderful, and it's heartbreaking when a family wants a baby, but for whatever reason can't have one of their own. I'm in favor of policies that make families of any type possible, as long as those policies are safe and don't cause harm. In my view, paying for surrogacy recognizes the labor, pun intended, that women do while providing surrogacy service. There are reasonable limits that can be placed on surrogacy agreements to prevent exploitation and reduce disagreements and disputes. But everyone else in this process is paid. So too should be the women who do the most work. But what do you think? Should Canada's laws change to allow for commercial surrogacy? Or is this the commodification of babies? You be the judge. I'm Christine Van Gyn, and remember, a freer Canada starts with you.